So welcome to how to use Blueprint variables. The first thing I want to point out is that I have now upgraded to 4.12.5, so it won't affect this video I don't think, but you might want to upgrade to that fairly shortly or higher. So what are we going to do in this video? We are going to aim to change the color of this aim point, or at least we're going to get set up so that the aim point can be either red, amber or green. I know it's blue there, but that's what we're going to do. And to do that, we're going to use a blueprint variable that we're going to define here, a reference, and we're going to look at the whole architecture and how we find what state we should be in based on the tank aiming component. So let's see how all that hangs together now. So we're back to that age-old question, what's least fun about this game right now? So I'm just going to turn my controller on and have a look. Well, I think the thing that I don't like the most is that I don't know when I can fire. I'm mashing the fire button, hoping that I'm going to be able to fire. I want some sort of affordance or indication that it is possible to fire right now. And that actually brings us nicely in our iterative loop back to user interface. We've been working on player 2. That's kind of working. There's more to do. But let's go and get some stuff done on the user interface. What I want to do is to change the crosshair in the middle of the screen here. I want to change its color. If we are locked, i.e. the barrel is not moving, I want it to be green. Oh, well, if we're locked and we're reloaded, I want it to be green. If the barrel is currently moving, like so, then we're aiming, I want it to be amber. We can fire, but it's not necessarily going to go where we want. And if we haven't reloaded yet, I want it to be red. So it would start off red. As soon as the tank's ready to go, it would go green. And as soon as we move the barrel, it would go amber until we line up again, and then it would go green. All right, so I think that would give a very simple traffic light system. How are we going to do it though? How is our crosshair going to get its color? Well, let's recap the architecture. We have a player UI widget. Remember that puppy? There he is, the player UI widget, and it's got this little dot in the middle of it here. And that's the thing we want to change the color of. That was created by the player controller. Do you remember that? If we look back at the player controller blueprint, which is under the tank, it created this UI widget in its event graph in the begin play. The player controller controls a tank. We know that, right? The player controller controls a given tank. In fact, we've even, on the player controller, got ourselves a getControlledTank method. It's just not currently available to Blueprint. So while we're here, let's sort that out. This is a use function, and we want to make this available to Blueprint. So it's going to be Blueprint callable, and it's going to have a category of setup, I would say. Always a good choice if we're not sure now. If it's going to be blueprint callable, then a blueprint is a subclass of this C++ class, so it can't be in the private section anymore. It's going to need to be in a protected section so that subclasses can access this. Okay, so that's a simple code change I've made there to the tank player controller.h. Just made it blueprint callable and made it protected. There are the things I've changed. So I'll compile the code while continuing the discussion on the slide. So the player controller controls a tank, and now, once that is finished, in Blueprint, we will be able to get the controlled tank. That'll be a method we'll actually be able to access from Blueprint. I just heard the compile succeed. There you go. The tank has an aiming component on it. We know that by now. Now, the player UI widget is going to want to talk to that aiming component. It's going to want to know what state the aiming component is. We're going to do some work on the aiming component actually after this video. And one of the three things we're going to do is give it an enum state, an enumerator, which we used in the first section of this course, on the bull cow section. And that is going to be one of three states. It's either going to be locked, i.e. lined up and green, aiming, i.e. the barrel's moving, or reloading, in which case it's red and you can't fire. So that state is going to be in the aiming component, but the player UI widget wants to know that state, and the aiming component is a little bit distant from the UI widget. So what we're going to do is set up a blueprint variable in the UI widget. Let's see how that would work. We're going to come over, in fact, let's do it now. We'll come over here to the UI widget, go to the graph of the player UI blueprint, add yourself a variable, call it, I don't know, let's say BP aiming comp reference, quite explicit, and then the type of this variable on the blueprint is going to be a very specific type. It is actually going to be a tank aiming component type. Okay, and that's a BP aiming comp reference type there. So we'll use that later. So that's what I mean by a blueprint variable. Let's just compile that, make sure everything's happy. And that's what this blue box here is. Now the blueprint variable, when we set it up, it's going to point to the aiming component of the tank in question, i.e. the player's controlled tank. And then once that blueprint variable points to this aiming component, the player UI widget will have a bridge by which it can check the state of the aiming component. So looking at this diagram, especially if I go back a stage, it's pretty obvious where we need to do this hookup. It's in the player controller, right? Because it is the connection between the UI widget and the tank. So we're going to be focusing inside the player controller when we do this. So let's dive into the player controller and think about how we are going to do it. First, let's get the reference. We're talking about references, so inside the tank player controller, we already have this reference here to create player UI blueprint widget. Now, provided that in your player UI blueprint, you have already made this variable and it is of type tank aiming component, and this blueprint is saved and compiled, then in the tank player controller, when you come off the create player UI blueprint reference, you should be able to search for aiming and you'll see this set blueprint aiming component reference. Okay, so in terms of our diagram, what we're doing here is we are telling it what this blueprint, this link here, this curved arrow. All right, so where are we going to get the blueprint aiming component reference from? Well, hopefully now we have this get controlled tank method. There you go. Get controlled tank is available here. Now, why is it available here? Because we're in a tank player controller blueprint whose parent class is a tank player controller. And provided that you added the code I've got highlighted in the tank player controller header file, then this blueprint callable method will now be available. As long as it's protected and blueprint callable, you can call get controlled tank. So there it is. There is get controlled tank working on itself, working on this tank player controller, saying what tank am I controlling? Now, from the tank, we need to get the aiming component. So are we able to do that at the moment? Well, no, we're not able to get the aiming component off this tank. Why not? Well, let's go and have a look at the tank and see how exposed the aiming component is. So the tank.h, you see for the movement component, we've made it blueprint read-only, but for the aiming component, we haven't done that yet. Okay, so if you make your in your tank.h, in your protected section, if you make your aiming component blueprint read-only and recompile, that's the code we're adding, what I've got highlighted there in blue. Then, of course, from anywhere in a subclass, we should be able to get hold of in the class itself or a subclass, we should be able to get hold of the tank aiming component. Now, the context we're in when we drag off here is actually the tank. So it's the tank itself. So we should have no trouble now getting tank aiming component. So we've gone from the tank to its aiming component, and then we pass that reference into the blueprint aiming component reference. Does that make sense? Hopefully it does. Let's recap where we are in the diagram. We've got to the tank, we've got the aiming component. So that is what's coming out here. And we're setting this blueprint variable here up here. I'm just going to move things around a little bit so that the execution flow works a bit better, like so. And I'm taking the execution flow out of the viewport. So we create this blueprint widget, we add it to the viewport, and then we set the blueprint variable over on it. Pretty cool. Let's compile and save that. Now, over in the player UI blueprint, how do we do this? Well, click on the designer tab. Let's go and look at this little dot. I'm going to make it a bit bigger, my little crosshair. I'm going to make it, say, 7 or even more. I'm going to make it 10 by 10 for now so you can really see it. It's larger now, 10 by 10. So there it is. Now, here's the color. You could just change the color here, but of course we want to do it programmatically. So it's all very well it being pink. What we do not want to do is change this color in the event graph in some strange way by like grabbing this aim point here and then getting it and trying to set a color. Don't do that, because the only way it will work from an execution flow point of view is every tick, and that's pretty horrible. We want this to happen only when it needs to happen. So forget doing that. The other problem with doing it this way is that you wouldn't be able to see here that that color is being changed in the event graph, and you'd have to notice that. If we use this bind functionality, so we're now inside the player UI blueprint in the designer, under the appearance section, next to color and opacity, you can see create binding. Now what that's going to do is it's going to create this binding called get aim point color and opacity. Now I don't like it being called _0, so I'm going to take that off over here in the functions list. But now this player UI has a function event graph. And what this is going to do is allow us to set programmatically the color. Let's try setting it to blue. So I've clicked this little blue here, and I'm just saying, okay, if we were to look here now at the color and opacity, forget the fact it's pink. It doesn't actually matter what color that is now. It's bound to this method here. If I click on the magnifying glass, it takes me there. If I compile and play, you can see that the color has changed to blue. And that indicates to everybody concerned that the color is actually not set here in the designer anymore, but it is set according to this bound function. So now we have to talk about how we're actually going to set that color. And that is going to be the subject of the next video. So well done, save everything up, commit your work, and I'll see you in the next one.